After drawing international attention this week with his speech in Davos, Prime Minister Mark Carney is back to his domestic agenda. He and his cabinet have just wrapped up a two-day meeting in Quebec City before Parliament returns Monday. And Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre says enough words. It's time for action.
So far, Mr. Carney, in this regard and in every other, has been very fortunate to be judged by his rhetoric and his stated intentions rather than by his results. Because nearly a year into his term, the rhetoric has changed, but the reality is not. The illusion of purpose is there, but the results have not shown up with it.
Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer joins me now from Regina. Nice to see you, sir. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So you heard the Prime Minister's speech in Davos. He said the old order is not coming back, and he encouraged middle powers like Canada to band together in the face of coercion from great powers. Do you agree with Carney's assessment that this long-standing U.S.-led rules-based international order is over?
Well, there's no doubt that President Trump is dramatically changing the nature of global affairs and talking to historic allies in a much more aggressive and in some cases hostile way. But what was frustrating about that speech is that it came on the heels of a visit by Prime Minister Carney to China, where he talked about establishing a new world order with a communist regime and strengthening cooperation. This is a country that he referred to as the largest national security threat facing Canada. So even within his own speech, Mark Carney in that speech, called on middle powers to band together and not try to, curry favor with one of the powerful countries, because those powerful countries will just pick us off one at a time. Literally, after just a few days, doing exactly what he warned against with the communist regime in Beijing. So, when you look at what our leader Pierre Poilievre was pointing out is that if you didn't know anything about Mark Carney and you read that speech, great. But when you look at his track record, when you look at what he's actually done since becoming Prime Minister, the affordability crisis is worse, food inflation is worse. We still haven't got a major project through the Major Projects Office that he said would move at unimaginable speeds. So, we're almost a year into his term. Pitter patter, let's get at her. Let's actually do the things that'll help this economy, remove liberal legislation that block development, stop the inflationary deficits that drive up the cost of food. People can't eat speeches, and empty rhetoric isn't very nutritious. So let's actually do the things, not just talk about the things.
On China, though, you have to admit farmers in your province are pretty happy, at least the canola ones, about what he was able to get out of Beijing. Are you saying that he should not have concocted a deal at all with Xi? He should have just left it as it was?
Well, this is a very interesting point. There's a lot of confusion among canola growers right now because the only thing we have is Mark Carney's statement, where he says he expects tariffs to be reduced to 15%, not zero, which is what we had under the Conservative government, but that he expects them to be lowered by the end of March and that he expects them to stay off for at least a year. Well, that's not quite the full removal permanently on tariffs on canola. It seems the deal that he's just made is very certain and clear on what China gets, but uncertain and unclear of what Canada gets in return. It's also frustrating that we had leverage, Canada had leverage that it didn't use. Mark Carney had leverage that he just left on the table. This government gave $1 billion loan, guaranteed loan, taxpayer gift to a Chinese company to build ferries for British Columbia. That was a bargaining chip that Carney chose not to use. We have what China needs. They need to feed their people. They need to fuel their economy. They can't get by without what Canada has. So, to sign a deal like that with all that uncertainty about what it actually means for canola producers, the fact that they're not 0% tariffs, the fact that they're not permanently renewed, isn't quite what Mark Carney said that he would be able to achieve during the election when he said he was the guy with the magic wand that could fix all of this.
You and Trump are aligned on one thing at least, sir, and that is this China question. He just posted on Truth Social not too long ago about Carney saying Carney voted in favor of doing business with China, who will eat them up within the first year. We also know Trump was not a huge fan of what the Prime Minister said in his speech in Davos. He said that, we're not very grateful to the United States in terms of the military support that they provide, that Canada lives because of the United States. What's your take on how this has gone? Do you think that it was wise for Carney to rankle the president, or is it important for us to branch out and really take a stand as to what this country is standing for in this tumultuous era?
Well, I know that Mark Carney would love to always have this conversation in the framing against Donald Trump, but it's Conservatives who are aligned with Canadians about being very cautious with how Canada deals with China. Canadians don't appreciate when our citizens are imprisoned illegally, like the two Michaels faced. Canadians don't like it when the Chinese embassies open up illegal police stations across the country that intimidate and harass Canadian citizens. Canadians don't like it when the communist regime interferes in our election. And as it relates to diplomatic relations and trading relationships, Conservatives have always believed that we need to diversify our trading relationships. That's why the previous Conservative government signed dozens of free trade deals all over the world, South America, Europe, Asia, all to make sure that we were not too dependent on the United States. What Mark Carney's liberal policies have done is made us more dependent by canceling big energy projects, making it so that the U.S. continues to be our most important customer on energy, by imposing an industrial carbon tax on Canadian manufacturers, something that American manufacturers don't face, hurting our ability to export products around the world. And again, we're about a year into Mark Carney's mandate. What's he actually done? You know, what's he actually accomplished? He's got a major projects list that none of them have actually proceeded. He promised to solve these tariff deals. He promised a deal on U.S. tariffs by the end of July. And he called the communist regime in Beijing the most serious national security threat facing Canada. And then he goes and talks about a new world order and strengthening cooperation. I think Canadians rightfully have a lot of questions about what that means for our economy, for our national security interests.
I mean, I guess the Prime Minister would say he has signed that deal with China. There's been other arrangements with Europe. Indonesia got a free trade deal. There has been some progress on some of these trade files. And we actually saw some news from the Globe and Mail today that traffic through the Port of Montreal is way up as trade with Europe is actually at a level it hasn't been in a long time. So he would point to that as some points of success. But I take your point about maybe there needs to be more done. And one thing that you are proposing in your party is this Canadian Sovereignty Act. You're going to table it in the House next week. Tell me what's in that legislation and what your party hopes it will do to help Canada as we grapple with these changes right now.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for that question. Just very quickly, though, some of the things you mentioned are MOUs, preliminary agreements, not actually implementation of actual deals. But on the Canada Sovereignty Act that our leader is proposing, there's a lot of great stuff in there. It's fantastic. And if Liberals had listened to us years ago, we wouldn't likely even be having this nature of a conversation right now. What we're calling for is, first of all, for the Liberal government to remove those Liberal laws like the ban on West Coast oil and gas shipping, the No More Pipelines Act. We're calling on them to remove that industrial carbon tax that adds huge layers of costs on our manufacturers. It also helps drive up the cost of food, farm equipment, food processing, fertilizer, all gets more expensive when that industrial carbon tax keeps going up. We're calling on the government to abandon their plans for the fuel standards tax that's going to add about 17 cents a litre. So in addition to removing bad Liberal laws, we're also proposing wonderful Conservative ideas to kickstart the economy, to really provide some rocket fuel. Like, we're calling on the government to implement a capital gains tax exemption when those capital gains are reinvested in the economy. We hear this from coast to coast, from small businesses to large businesses. Access to capital is very difficult to find in Canada. A lot of that investment dollars flows to the United States after 10 years of Liberal government. So what we're saying is if a Canadian invests in Canada, let's make that capital gain tax-free. That's going to open up a huge pool of capital to really kickstart and provide some rocket fuel to our economy, see those jobs numbers go up again. So it's just a sample of what we're calling on the government to do our first week back in Parliament. And it's just another example of how Conservative solutions are concrete and real, in stark contrast to the rhetoric we see from Carney and the Liberals.
Speaking of job numbers, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre will face potentially a leadership review. We know members will be voting next week in Calgary about whether to have a leadership review, whether to continue with Pierre Poilievre. There's been a lot of talk in this town, Andrew, I'm sure you know, about percentage points and what figure Poilievre needs to get to keep his job after that vote in Calgary. What is the percentage that's going through your mind? What would you like to see him achieve from members?
Look, I just want a great result. Our caucus is united. We're focused. Our members realize what happened in the last few years. Pierre Poilievre was the first person to raise the alarm bell on inflation. He was the only one. In fact, many of the Liberal experts completely disregarded that issue. He was right about that. He's the only one talking about the cost of living crisis. Grocery inflation in Canada is higher than any other G7 country. People are still struggling just to provide the basic necessities of life, and Pierre is their champion. I believe our members see that in him. They see the historic gains we made in the last election, over 40% of the vote, new seats that we've won in regions in this country that Conservatives had never won before, new voters. I expect we're going to see a lot of people at convention that have never been to a political convention before and may have voted for the first time in the last election because of Pierre Poilievre's inspiration. So we have some work to do. We're not quite where we want it to be, but what we need to do is build on that success, and I'm confident that members are going to see that in Pierre, and we'll see what happens in Calgary, but optimistic.
All right, let's leave it there. Thank you so much, Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer. Nice to see you, sir. Thanks for coming on.
Great to see you too.